Please allow me to begin this talk with the title of the paper upon which it is based, and it is Migratory Aesthetics in Diasporic Claustrophobia. I shall begin the discussion with the idea of textualization of movement in literature. Mobility as an aesthetic is a multidimensional complexity in which, as Team Cresswell points out, what links point A and point B is not a blank or neutral space, the way, say, the aesthetic as a category is sometimes construed to be an innocent space. That is to say, one that is universal and abstract as opposed to one that is particular and concrete. On the contrary, it is a meaningful space of displacement, a socially produced location of embodied space. Mobilization processes of art forms in their textual and contextual determinations involve an understanding of the dynamics of textual mobility and mobile textuality itself. Such dynamics are socially and politically inflected processes, shaping the articulation of mobility as an aesthetic as well as the aesthetic of mobility. As I try to show, these processes are contradictory but mutually constitutive of, on one hand, immobilization, and on the other, mobilization, which both enable an aesthetic that is held together in tension by experience of a diaspora under globalization. The tension does not result in a unidimensional process, but a relational dynamic in which the very act of displacement between points A and B, that nomadic aesthetic place in between, becomes a dynamic site of contestation, of resistance, complicity, and meaning. In that space, as this talk suggests, the Filipino short story entitled Arrivederci interrogates the inscription of the tension between mobility and immobility, wherein lies the migratory aesthetic that marks the lives of the Filipino workers in Italy. There they navigate distances and experience the push and pull of mobility and immobility in the global capitalist market, engaging in life and death struggles as objectified migratory commodities. The thematic reinscription of their experience in the short story contributes what is referred to in this talk as the aesthetic of diasporic claustrophobia. In this regard, in the very textuality of literature of diaspora, what is referred to as migratory aesthetic is underpinned by a concrete context under globalization, which functions as a staging ground of art forms, that material and determinate ground of a set of conditions, of possibilities, of experiences at a fixed point in time and place upon which geopolitics is at play, mobilizing and mobilized by meanings. In aesthetic terms, this context rematerializes and is rematerialized in the language of signifiers, literary elements, and imaginative figurations. This rematerialization is set in motion upon figural displacement in a process of aesthetic reinscription, in which passive literary elements are reconfigured into an active narrative space. In the reinscription, for example, locations, or called setting, are shown simultaneously through distant framing in a way that allows one setting to be juxtaposed with another bifocally in a reciprocally consecutive relation between the stories inside and the stories outside. In this dynamic, the aesthetic as a category is no longer isolated nor constituted as a separate realm internally, the text itself as so called, as a traditionally understood concept, but refers to politics externally, that is to say, its context. In this sense, migratory aesthetics, which takes place as a moment of mobility in the short story, is what results from a play of signification between text and context, migrating, as it were, from the abstraction of pure aesthetics to an embodiment of a form of experience that is inextricably linked to diasporic knowledge rather than separated from it. As such, the mobilization process is marked by a shift in the thematic focus of the literature of diaspora, from a general sense of alienation into what is specifically experienced as diasporic claustrophobia, resulting from the tension of immobility and mobility in art as in life of overseas Filipino workers. This process is produced between the conditions of poverty is developing or sending countries like the Philippines and relative affluence of developed or receiving countries like Italy under globalization, which is mutually constitutive with short stories, politics and aesthetics, content and form, cognition and art. Such a process may be conceived, as Creswell has suggested, as a polarity in the geographical imagination, consisting of, as one might construe, on one hand, mobility, and the other, fixity or immobility. By convention, fixity is privileged as a virtue, while mobility is marginalized as vice. Although fixity indeed has often been morally privileged over mobility by traditional society, it might be posited instead, especially in diaspora, that both ends of the polarity are to be equally interrogated, ethically in juxtaposition with each other, as they are held in tension by today's globalization in all its contradictions. In terms of mobility's textualization, this tension does not result in a zero-sum game, but in a concrete dynamic in which the very act of figural displacement between points A and B, that nomadic aesthetic in-between space, itself becomes the site of contestation, resistance, complicity, and meaning. From this perspective, the reciprocal constitution of mobility and immobility of literature in that nomadic aesthetic in-between space becomes an embodiment of social processes as inscriptions of the diasporic experience of Filipino domestic workers abroad. As his talk further suggests, itinerant tropes shuttle between formal fictional elements at the site of their displacement between literal and metaphorical places, a movement that underscores at once shifts in physical and symbolic spaces. Entailing formal or textual operations and deploying what may be referred to as literary technologies, forms and textual practices are configured and reconfigured in a dynamic which is akin to what Deleuze and Guattari referred to as deterritorialization and reterritorialization, processes involving the production of virtual and possible spaces as literary critical borders are crossed. As will be discussed later, however, in the context of the story, deterritorialization may not necessarily equate with mobility, as ethically assumed and conventionally understood. In the context of so-called globalization, such processes are thematized in the story in what may be called Diasporic Claustrophobia. In particular, His talk tries to show the semiotic dynamics of literary forms and textual practices that are aligned with the socio-cultural logic of mobility and immobility. To be analyzed is printed literature, an art form that is itinerant for its portability, the short story genre. Specifically, as mentioned earlier, the focus will be the Filipino short story by Fanny Garcia, an award-winning work, Arrivederci, written in 1982 and published in the Philippines. As a narrative type, it is an example of the modern short story, a genre whose popularity since the early 20th century owes partly to its relative brevity, as opposed to the 19th century novelistic form. Compared to the novelistic form, which tends to be not only longer, but also more sprawling and open in structure, the short story is more focused in its thematic scope and more compressed in its aesthetic. In contemporary Philippine literature, this story has been cited as an example of what's called literature diaspora. Understandably, the theme of diaspora in Philippine literature has been shaped by the inequities of globalization in the concrete lives of Filipino exiles and overseas contract workers, particularly of women domestic workers, who have been labeled under abstract categories like disembodied flows by migration scholars. Such abstractions reduce them to mere objects and statistics, not subjects, dissociated from their material body, sheer cogs as a labor force that enable global capitalist machinery to keep rolling in circulation and accumulation and reproduction in order to perpetuate itself. But for a brief background, historically, Italy has been one of the top receiving countries of Filipino land-based contract workers who are all over Italy but concentrated in Rome, where, as McGovern asserts in one of her scholarly articles, the majority of Filipino women, migrant workers, are domestic helpers. Their experience of the possibilities and constraints of being overseas contract workers provides concrete illustrations of the tension between mobility and immobility and allows for a specific conceptualization of the contradictory structural forces governing their lives based on policies and practices that shape the dynamics of labor export under globalization. Filipino domestic workers in Rome, as elsewhere in the world, where as domestic helpers they live mobile yet immobile lives, shuttled to and from their employers' homes, train stations, churches, and parks. On the margins of their lives of every day, they attend events and occasions, celebrate Philippine national holidays, set up cultural programs, hold Filipino fiestas, attend religious worships and ceremonies, join social gatherings after Sunday, Mass, and so on. In, across, and between all these spaces, mobility might mean less a matter of realizing their diasporic aspiration of social mobility for their own families back home in the Philippines than living disposable lives in short-term or part-time jobs in a foreign country, with or without contracts that define their migratory realities. In this sense, movement and stasis are faces of the same coin we call mobility. The next part is about mobile textuality and textual mobility of Filipino diasporic experience. Arrivederci is a text whose aesthetic is fraught with the tension between mobility and immobility in its literary surfaces, which is configured and reconfigured through the play of formal features, such as the spatial, what we call setting, and the temporal, what we call, say, foreshadowing along narrative space. Other narratological techniques or narratives like narrative structure, as well as elements like images, character, various tropes, and so many other technologies of fiction. Although fairly new problematic in the humanities, in the social sciences, such a tension between mobility and immobility is a key issue. For example, in migration studies. Although situated in the present, Arrivederci, the short story, often narratively interlaces past with the present events, which transpire in Italy. And while written in the realist mode, it integrates at length scenes of fortune telling, dreams for the future, and memories way back in the Philippines while set in the here and now. Moreover, while the setting is in Italy, the narrative space is stretched across oceans, shuttling between the Philippines and Italy within the story's structure. And while the geography is European ground, the characters' habits and practices are recognizably Filipino. In terms of its literary surfaces alone, therefore, semiotically, not only is the story's textuality mobile, its mobility is textual. There, exilic narratives are told and lived in temporal mobility. Let me then talk about the narrative as a temporal mobility, as it unfolds in particular in this story. According to Yuri Lotman, narrative emerges out of a character's crossing of symbolically charged spaces. In this sense, a plot is reducible to a basic episode, the crossing of the basic topological borders in the plot's spatial structure. Indeed, the narrative is triggered at the moment of border crossing, as the bare structure of Arrivederci suggests, which moves as follows. Divided up into 4 sections, the story seems like a collection of scenes of many places captured by a camera, zooming in and out as it follows the narrative, which is either dominated by narration or description of people doing something while coming or going. It might be noted that while direct narration is conventionally temporal, as it usually follows the causal chronology of events, the use of indirect narration in which description and dialogue are paramount tends to be effectively spatial in the unfolding of the story, as it often depicts a scene rather than tell a story right away or straight away. A fuller discussion of the possible implications of this point will be made later. The first section of the story is about what is going on inside a tourist bus during a weekend off of Filipino domestic workers on an excursion. The outing is estimated to be a 5-hour trip to the caves, a tourist spot outside Rome. Inside the bus, we are excitedly engaged in various activities, singing on karaoke, palm reading, gambling, gossiping, joking, conducting stage show sort of contests, all as if they were in a town fiesta or feria back in the Philippines. The main characters, Vicenta and Nelly, meet here for the first time to become fast friends later in the story. Vicenta is also called Vicine in the Philippines and Vicky in Italy. Both temporal and narrative strategies deployed in this section juxtapose themes and techniques that will be repeated and reconfigured in the rest of the story. The second section consists of virtual vignettes of collective and individual lives of use of the Filipino domestic workers in Italy. By definition, vignettes are plotless descriptive scenes rather than standalone literary works. This section is about the close camaraderie the Filipinos in the tour group have with their compatriots, kababayans, and the new friendship forged between the two main characters, Nelly and Vicenta, as the bus arrives at its destination. Vicenta confides in Nelly about her poverty back home in San Isidro and her loneliness and hardships in Italy as a domestic helper. She also admits having concealed from family and friends back home the truth about her dismal condition as a domestic worker in Italy in order to sustain their illusion of pride and happiness with a relative, a friend, and a village mate who's now working abroad. These two main characters engage in a long conversation about their lives in Italy and the Philippines, leading to a friendship that would be deepened in subsequent weekend offs. The third section starts with Nelly, who feels deeply bored by this series of relentless and meaningless repetitiveness of everyday life. The sense of how relentless and meaningless repetitiveness of everyday life as a domestic helper. A month after she last met Vicenta on the usual weekend off. It ends with indirect narration using dialogues about how Nelly and Vicenta have become close friends since their first excursion to the caves. Later, while Nelly feels increasing isolation from her work and friends in Italy, Vicenta finds solace in the newfound friendship with her. While Nelly wants to break free from her connections in Italy, Vicenta wants to be connected more closely. However, Vicenta confides in Nelly her terrible fear of being raped by her male employer, a fear she repeatedly expresses to Nelly, and about which she asks for her much needed help. Still, Nelly decides to keep away from Vicenta. The last section opens up with the news in an Italian newspaper about the suicide of Vicenta. By jumping from the apartment building where she worked, as the news goes, committed after finding out that her seaman boyfriend was to get married to another woman, according to the report of her employers. The Filipino domestic workers, especially Nelly, know better, of course, as Vicente had confided about her fear of being raped by his male employer. They wonder how they could cover up the truth about her suicide, to be consistent with the lie of living in comfort in Italy that Vicenta was telling her family all along. As Nelly writes the letter that tells a fiction about Vicenta's death, that she died in a car accident instead, just in case the body discovered to be all battered and broken by her family. The last sentence of the story reminds the characters of the three different names by which the now dead Vicenta was called in life. A multiplicity of identities across locations between the Philippines and Italy. As the story says, sa San Isidro, si Vicenta at si Vicky ay si Bising. In other words, in San Isidro, Vicenta, and Vicky is Bising. One and the same person with different names. Once she crosses the borders and returns to the Philippines, the dead balikbayan is translated as repatriate or return migrant. The dead balikbayan in a box or a coffin, Vicenta and Vicky become Bising again. The multiplicity of names by which the single individual is called is suggestive of much of the mobility of subjectivity among Filipinos who live diasporic lives, as they are evocative of the fiction that they are forced to repeat in order to sustain and make bearable their lives abroad. As domestic workers living under the lie that is the promise of globalization, A political critique is revealed with the story's mobile aesthetic through the use of powerful temporal and spatial technologies and extensions of the narrative. In the temporal mobility of the narrative, truth and lie shuttle back and forth between and across the characters' lives in the Philippines and Italy, where the borders are at once permeable yet impenetrable for Filipino domestic workers. As the first section provides a foreshadowing, such as Vicenta's sudden breathlessness and Mia painting spell, the conversation between Nelly and Vicenta in the final section anticipates the tragedy that will befall the latter at the end of the story, underscoring the character's diasporic journey in time. In the plot structure, the first and last sections are linked by a temporal connection, so that the reader might point to the first section as chronologically preceding the events of the last section. But that chronological flow is interlaced with spatial shifts across geographies, as memories of home in the Philippines punctuate the story, which is set in Italy, especially in the middle section. But the second and third sections break the movement of the temporal line established by the narrative thread of the first section, save for certain descriptive details that serve as foreshadowing of future events. Departing from the overall narration of the first section, the second section is evidently less temporal and more spatial as it zooms in and out of seeming vignettes and images of the Filipino domestic helpers laboring in Italy with the predictability and repetitiveness of the clock, a central image of the middle section. The clock's function temporalizes but also spatializes, defining the narrative space within which the mobility or immobility of characters are marked. Focusing on Vicenta's sufferings in Italy, the midsection is variously about the lies she has sent to kababayans about her life in Italy, her longings, anxieties about home, and her constant fear while living in her employer's residence. This section foregrounds Vicenta's experience of rejection by Nelly in her plea for mobility. That is, to be allowed to live with Nelly's Filipino friends in their apartment as a live out rather than a live in domestic worker, in the hope of saving herself from sexual abuse, a fate that she suspects would befall on her any time in her employer's residence. As the temporal line of the narrative is marked by shifts in space, now I go into the spatial mobility of narrative as setting. Franco Moretti has suggested that narrative as a temporal category is a kind of matrix based on space. Following this, what is called setting or geographical areas in fiction are narrative matrices. For Moretti, each space is a template that determines its own kind of actions, its plot, its genre, so that settings or spaces map out the plot's direction like a ground plan, following the old definition of plot as a small piece of ground, to quote Moretti. Etymologically, he adds, plot as such would shift from place to a way narrative is organized. In general, a fictional work setting is a description of where and when the story takes place, establishing an atmosphere or mood, a backdrop against which the action takes place, although the degree of its significance varies from story to story. However, in the context of globalization, owing to widespread migrations and other mobile features of global modernity, displacement of people across geographies produces a sense of cultural dislocation which reduces, expands, or modifies the imagination as a result of or resulting in a kind of cultural distancing or movement away from the native, reducing its distance from the foreign. This phenomenon, however, produces these disjunctions, ambivalences, as well as hybridities between local and foreign, and national regional identities, where it is no longer easy to see where one ends and the other begins across an array of mobilities, cross-cultural configurations and reconfigurations. In this sense, contrary to conventional imaginary, a story setting ceases to be a passive spatial-temporal background, but an active agency in how distances are negotiated in the process of dislocation between one location and another, transforming it into a narrative space. Beyond setting, in a narrative space, there could be at once more than one locality imagined, allowing for multiple and malleable synchronous localities. In this sense, it is indeed a kind of spatio-temporal complex in the language of narratology. In particular, Ruth Ronan allows for some active agency to setting by referring to frames as opposed to setting in order to describe places and locations, which, she says, provide a topological determination in events and states in a story. Ronan frames differ according to their position in the overall organization of the fictional narrative. Indeed, while a setting is the 0 point where the actual story events and story states are localized, what Ronan calls distant frames are spatial locations capable of extending over a sequence of actions, events, and situations, but independent of any of them, to quote Ronan. In the story, by deploying a pattern of opposition and juxtaposition for comparison and contrast, the spatio-temporal complex results in combinatory and hybrid narrative features to achieve, say, the effect of a montage in the description of fictional places. In this, distant framing allows for a pattern of simultaneous experiences of life of the characters in the Philippines, where they are professionals with university degrees, as juxtaposed to that in Italy, where they are de-skilled workers. A similar sense of synchronicity and simultaneity is achieved in the depiction of Filipino practices in the Italian terrain, or, for example, in the description of the house, which is described as a spatial villa of one of the Italian employers, versus the apartment of the Filipinos, which is described as a cramped studio apartment. More crucially, it also allows for understanding of what the story refers to as the Filipino-Italian time, suggestive of both a slowness of movement and a tardiness for appointments. A notion that binds as it separates the diasporic lives of both Filipino, migrant, and on one hand, and the European citizen on the other, destabilizing by hyphenation the implied hierarchy of privilege between the foreign and the native. As a technology of fiction, setting now becomes a socio-historical space that marks, that is to say, suggests, or allows for possibilities and limits of the events that take place in it. As mentioned earlier, the setting of the opening section of Arrivederci is the Italian tourist bus, which is moving along toward its tourist destination in this outing, so-called outing of Filipino domestic workers on a weekend break. As it does, the bus is transported by the narrative into another place in which the foreign setting becomes a native place, even as a native navigates a foreign space, in what the characters do, what they hear, or what they say in their conversations, several of which are quoted in the following discussion in Tagalog and translated in English by yours truly. I quote, "Malakas na pinatutugtog ang stereo recorder. Ang iba'y sumasabay sa mga iaawit na Ingles, Filipino, Bicolano, Bisaya." Translation, "The sound of the stereo recorder is very loud. Some people are singing along with songs in English, Filipino, Bicolano, Visayan." Unquote. The cassette tapes being played so loudly have traveled all the way from the Philippines to Italy, transforming the setting itself through sound, as in, to quote from the story, "Maraming dalang cassette tape mula sa Pilipinas." English, "So many cassette tapes are brought from the Philippines." Unquote. All along the way, it is as if the Italian tour bus is in the Philippines and not in Italy, transformed by the narrative into a little cramped box like a genie that magically contains endless memories of home evoked by sound. Such mobility turns setting into a mutable space, a hybrid space. A setting slides between the literal to the metaphorical. A space, kind of space, according to the more expansive sense of distant framing. In this sense, untruth becomes complicit with truth in an interlace of localizing practices and memories in the encounter between the European setting and the Filipino narrative in diaspora. In the process, the sense of nationhood goes beyond territoriality, and the interests of global capitalism come face to face with each other in the processes of displacement of the story's aesthetic of mobility. To the extent that the story narrativizes space, I now talk about setting mobility and immobility. Indeed, the story is replete with words suggesting movement or development. In the first several paragraphs alone, the following words appear: outing, destination, trip, moving, gone to, journey, going outside, and so on and so forth. Virtually in equal measure, however, the story uses words suggesting immobility, inaction, or finality, such as partition, locked, in, waiting place, stopover, occupied, and so on and so forth. From the outside of the bus to the Filipinos' cramped apartment, to the affluent and spacious apartment of the employers, narrative space is divided up in two partitions that organize it into thematically relevant spaces like walls, rooms, front and back, mountains, roads, entrances, exits, and even a toilet Filipinos are not allowed to use, where places speak like characters as narrative spaces. At the outset of the story, the sense of setting, place, and space is foregrounded by the opening paragraph, which is packed with information concerning location, direction, destination, and distances between 2 points measured not just spatially, but temporally. I quote, "Linggo, 2 bus ang inarkila para sa outing. Ang pupuntahan ay isang kuweba sa bundok. Malakatedral ang ganda't kabuuan ng mismong kalikasan ang lumikha. 5 oras ang biyahe mula sa Roma." Translation, "Sunday, the 2 buses have been rented for the outing. The destination is a cave in the mountain, cathedral-like in its overall beauty, created by nature itself. 5 hours of ride from Rome." Unquote. Even the Italian bosses come to view for the reader in the language of space and its division, a domesticated space that is divided into sections. Quote, ang mga bus ay ang klaseng may partitions sa bandang dulo para sa isang munting kusina at munting kasillas. Translation, the buses are of the type with partitions at the back for a small kitchen and toilet. But the reader, unquote, but the reader quickly understands that even for an occasion like an outing, the character's mobility is constrained in all the basic corporeality where it matters. For long trips like this one, as a paragraph quickly adds, the toilet is locked. Nakakandado ang kasillas. Quote unquote. Moreover, underscoring the tension in their everyday lives that punctuates their conversations, specific jobs are juxtaposed that parallel the opposition between implied sites of mobility and immobility, such as the mobility of the stewardess and the immobility of the domestic helper. When Nellie says she prefers to travel than be mobilized by having too many kids, someone responds, dapat nag-stewardess ka, hindi katulong. Translation, you should have become a stewardess, not a domestic helper. Unquote. Therefore, the setting of the story is not just background that is moved upon, but as a place or space that moves. Between Italians seated in front of the bus and Filipinos at the back, it is not just a space upon which mobility is enabled, but a place by which it is disabled. As the bus starts to leave for its destination, the Filipino vacationers are reminded that the Italian driver has ordered strict compliance in maintaining cleanliness inside the bus and that they cannot use the toilet. Indeed, unquote, indeed, the drawing from this too, the moving bus may be said to suggest both mobility and immobility, functioning not just as setting in the conventional sense, but now as place for an instantaneous configuration of positions in which formal elements stand in fairly stable relation of coexistence to each other, while space is composed of intersections of mobile elements. Unquote. I shall now focus on the box, the image of the box, its moving images in the story and how it helps in the understanding of the narrative's configuration of positions. A balikbayan box, literally repatriate box, is a corrugated box containing items sent by overseas Filipinos, known as balikbayans, often shipped by freight forwarders or brought by Filipinos returning to the Philippines by air. Said to be a billion-dollar industry that alleviates homesickness of Filipino overseas. Filipinos overseas, in the popular imagination, it has become a symbol of the Filipino diaspora, whose income abroad helps poor relatives and family members and maintains the connections between home and not home. As an article about the balikbayan box in the internet says, this is the Filipino way, quote unquote. You can't go home without a box, it adds. As such, it is associated with the Filipino practice of pasalubong, a gift Filipinos coming home from abroad bring to their family and friends when they return. Images of movement or moving boxes against immobile spaces recur in the story, beginning with the description of the interior of the moving tourist bus, whose partitions make it seem like a cramped studio apartment itself, with its own tiny kitchen and a locked toilet. After the opening section, more images of the box appear either as sent or returned home from abroad by domestic workers. For example, in Nellie's dream of foreign lands as a child, the image of the box returns, one that contains numerous Christmas cards from her older sister, Ate Mirna, who had worked abroad. The box of cards kept in the house, somewhere, is what inspires the young Nellie to someday work abroad herself when she grows up, like her ate, older sister. This box will propel her journey to Europe as a domestic worker later in life, as we, as we see in the story. In the bus, exhausted from a sleepless night, Nellie falls asleep. In her dream, and I quote from the story, nakita niya ang sarili na isang paslit pa. Nasa kanilang salas, nakaupo sa lapag, katabi ang kahong lalagyan ng iba't ibang uri ng card na padala ng kanyang Ate Mirna. Inisa-isa niya ang mga card, ipinapalibot niya sa kanya ang mga pamaskong card, ibinabalik sa kahon ang iba, tuwang-tuwa siya sa mga nakalarawang yelo. Snow ang tawag doon, sabi ng kanyang Ate Mirna. Translate, she saw herself as a child. In the living room, she was seated on the floor next to the box that contained all the cards, all kinds of cards sent by her Ate Mirna. She picked up the cards one by one, surrounded herself with them, then returned some of them to the box. She was particularly very happy about the pictures of ice. Snow is what is called, said her Ate Mirna. Unquote. The image of the box comes back in several other places in the story, but this box is where the story's characters themselves live, virtually immobile, the apartment, that is, that they share in Italy. Quote, ang apartment ay para lamang sa isa o dalawang tao, kaya't may isa lang kwarto na siya na ring tulugan at salas. Isang makipot na kusina at isang makipot na banyo at kasillas. 6 sila sa apartment. Sa kamang pang-isahan ay magkatabi sina Berna at Didit. Sa kamang pang-dalawahan ay silang tatlo nina Evelyn at Cynthia. Translation. The apartment is only good for 1 or 2 people, which is why it is just one room, which is altogether the bedroom, the living room. There you have a narrow kitchen, a narrow toilet and bath. There are 6 of them living in that apartment, sleeping together in a single bed are Berna and Didit. On the bed meant for 2 people, sleep the 3 of them with Evelyn and Cynthia. And Jimmy sleeps on a folding bed in the kitchen. When Vicenta desperately asks to be accompanied in this apartment, Nellie says, ang sikip-sikip na sa apartment. Hindi na pwede tumanggap ng bago. Translate, the apartment is so cramped as it is, there is no more space for an additional individual. And as the story ends temporarily, the spatial image of the moving box is what is left for the reader to imagine. Upon Vicenta's suicide, her friends try to transport, one imagines her dead, battered body, mangled face, and broken bones, back home in a coffin with the untruth that she had lived in comfort and happiness abroad, sealed tight to ensure that the truth about domestic workers' suffering and suicide in diaspora stays a secret in this one final box. Quote, nakahinang naman ang taol, katwiran ni Berna. Translate, Berna argues the coffin is welded. In the box that is the apartment, mobility is constricted, and so are the lives of the Philippine overseas workers. Inside the box that is the coffin, there is the end of mobility in the final journey back home. To bring back the body of the repatriated domestic worker, the balikbayan, in a box. Just as in any balikbayan box, the weight of the box equals the embodiment of the thing inside. But this time, in all the corporeality of the dead body of a domestic worker experiencing diasporic space. Toward the end of the story, the compatriots ask each other what version of Vicenta's death ought to be revealed to the family. Anong version, to quote the Tagalog text, anong version ng kamatayan ang sasabihin natin? Unquote. This question also implies what version of our lives of suffering as diasporic workers shall we tell our folks back home, as opposed to the truths about our lives abroad. Between the untruth about their mobility and the truth about their immobility that ends in death, the balikbayan box shuttles between the literal and the metaphorical in their actual and imagined lives. In the midst of all this, the Filipinos respond in perhaps the only way they can as a collective community, united both in their truth and their lie about their lives in diaspora. The Filipinos contributed funds so that Vicenta's remains and her things could be brought back to the Philippines, as the story is about to end. Balikbayan, right from the start, Vicenta's leaving anticipates returning, where leave-taking is at once a coming and a going. She saw herself as a balikbayan even when she left the Philippines for Italy. As Vicenta herself says in the story, quote, hindi ko balak magtagal sa ibang bansa. Mag-iipon ako ng mag-iipon para makauwi agad sa Pilipinas. English, I don't plan to stay long in another country. I will just have to save and save so I could return quickly to the Philippines. Unquote. As we trace the appearance of the image of the box in the narrative text, we are able to produce a distant frame that functions like a cognitive map of the breadth of the story's narrative space between places and lives, thousands of miles apart. On the basis of the location and movements of the image, the reader is able to visualize mobility within a location or across locations in a containing space, such as, in the case of the bus, the spaces between the front and the back of the tourist bus, as described early in the story. Moreover, through the image of the box, the various characters and places in the story create a fictional, globalized world with a kind of awareness of the relations that situate them with respect to each other as mobile elements. As such, setting as place is in itself what takes place, a movement as much as a location. This configuration of positions between body and space, to the extent that movement becomes a condition for the production of a space, or if without it, a claustrophobia. This point will be developed later. So configured between body and space, we now proceed to the idea of character as mobile subjectivity. Character can be defined as any person, animal, or figure represented in a literary work. They are dynamic versus static characters, usually set up in each other's foil. Defined as any major character whose personal qualities contrast with another character. Conventionally, characters are the main actors in a fictional world in which they are act upon all other elements. In the story, there is a mutually constitutive movement between character and setting, depicting implicitly the Filipino domestic's view of globalization against the claims of global capitalism and the promises of the nation state. The two figures embodying the underside of globalization may be gleaned from the foil that are Nelly and Vicenta to each other. Foil is not just a technology of contrast in fiction, but in themselves, foils constitute the contradictory phases of gender diasporic subjectivity in the story. There is Nelly, as the dynamic character, mobile, active, aggressive, independent, and able to move between spaces and places in a willful act of diasporic mobility. Hard-headed, as Esther calls her. The young girl in the Philippines who once dreamt of traveling to foreign lands when she grew up is not the same person as the Nelly, now the 25-year-old woman who has ended up as a domestic helper in Italy. Although finally able to fulfill her dream of going abroad, she's bored to death with cleaning other people's homes day in and day out. Highly individualistic and adventurous, in her mind she's struggling to be free in order to explore the rest of Europe and travel to the US. And there is Vicenta, on the other hand, compared to Nelly. She is passive, lethargic, and lonely. Vicenta is the protagonist with multiple subjectivities as Vicenta, Vicky, as well as Bising. So the three names of Vicenta, Vicky, and Bising, by which is called and called upon all in one person with territorialized selves cutting across the diasporic border. There are two apparently contradictory modes of gendered subjectivity, as if images of a mirror's refraction confronting each other. The figures of Nelly and Vicky are characterized by Nefertita Jar in her article about this story entitled Two Women as follows. I quote Tadyar. Nelly rejects the recreated familial contexts Filipinas make of their domestic work situations and the daughter roles they perform within them. While liberating herself into autonomous individual subjectivity, her dissociation from the forms of reconstituted national colonial relations among Filipinos abroad reifies the heterogeneous practices of socializing as forms of stagnation. Hence, stagnation witnesses independence. As one in constant want of her company, Vicenta can hence only be, quoting the text in Tagalog, parang asong bubuntot-buntot ito sa kanya, or like a dog tailing after her. A woman beside herself, barely human, in need of mastery and affection. Unquote. With encouragement of Philippine government, recruitment agencies mushroomed in the 1970s and 1980s. Among them were fly-by-night, unethical recruitment agencies who peddled lies, like the corrupt politicians whose pockets lay lined. To those desperate to find jobs abroad, like Vicenta, who was assured of a life of comfort abroad, as she recalls her employment agency's assurance. I quote the text. Huwag daw akong mag-alala, huwag kong iparis sa pagkakatulong sa Pilipinas. Push button ng lahat-lahat. May washing machine, dishwashing machine, vacuum cleaner, floor polisher. Mababait ang magiging amo ko. Ituturing akong parang hindi na iba sa pamilya. Kapag nagbabakasyon sa ibang bansa, ang mga amo ko'y tiyak na kasama ko. Kaya't makapaglalakbay ako ng libre. Bibigyan ako ng mga damit at iba pang gamit. May medical insurance, malaking sweldo. Kaya gaano man kalaki ang gastos ko'y mababawi agad kahit wala pang isang taon. English. I was told not to worry. It was not like working as a domestic helper in the Philippines. Everything there is push button. The washing machine, dishwashing machine, vacuum cleaner, floor polisher. My employers will be good to me. I will be considered part of the family. If my employers go abroad for vacation, I will be brought along for sure, so I will be able to travel for free. I'll be given clothes and other things. We'll have medical insurance. The salary will be big enough, so I will be able to recover in less than a year the amount that I will have spent uh, going to Italy. Apart from the Balikbayan box, mobility spelled out everywhere else in the story. And so I now proceed to the idea of characters and their displacement, deterritorialized and de-skilled. More generally, dislocation involves an uprooting of a set of relations from an established context, resulting in literal and tangible, that is, physical or economic kind of movement, aligned with other forms such as figural and intangible displacement, as experienced by the characters, resulting in transfiguration as much as in their physicality as in their subjectivity. It is noteworthy that the characters do not seem to have fixed features throughout the story, as may be inferred from their direct or indirect characterization. In the conversation between Nelly and Vicky and the other minor characters, for example, Vicenta is described for the first time by Esther as looking very different from the Vicenta encountered elsewhere in the story. I quote, "Isang babae na 3 o 4 na beses nang nakikita si Nelly sa Roma. Mukhang lampas na ng 40. May ilang salit katla ang noo. May salit at ang puti ang unat, mahabang buhok na nakapunggos sa likod. Umpak ang mga pisngi, malalim ang mga mata. Payat at bahagyang pukot. Parang pagod na pagod. Simpleng-simple siya. Walang kahit anong alahas. Walang make-up, kaya't halatang namumutla. Luma ang damit at sapatos." English. A woman has been seen by Nelly in Rome for 3 or 4 times. She looks past 40 years old. She has deep lines across her forehead. There are some white hairs in her straight long hair that is tied in a bun at the back. The cheeks look hollow, the eyes deep set, thin and slightly bent. She looks very tired, looks very simple. She wears no jewelry, no makeup, so you can tell she's pale. Her dress and shoes are old." Unquote. At the start and end of the story, Nelly expresses concern about Vicenta's health due to her apparent physical frailty. Nelly says, "Kumain kang mabuti, ikaw nga payat ka." English, "Eat well, so you look so thin." To which Vicky replies, "Alam mo bang medyo mabilgo ako nang nasa Pilipinas?" English, "Did you know that I was roundish when I was in the Philippines?" Unquote. Toward the end of the story, Vicky is described again in reference to the news item about her alleged suicide that shows her passport photo. It is at this point that the reader realizes that Vicenta had been so transformed physically by Italy, having undergone a kind of physical reconfiguration that is completed by her suicide, a body beyond recognition. With the news that appeared was Vicenta's passport photo. Her face was brown, the cheeks are full, Vicenta is smiling, as the story describes. All the named characters in the story have been deterritorialized by de-skilling. These skilled workers include Linda, who used to be an accountant back in the Philippines, Esther, who was a nurse, Vicky, who was a teacher, Jimmy, who was an engineer, Lloyda, who finished psychology in college, Ben, who finished fine arts, Elmer, who was a seaman, and Nellie, who was a researcher, having completed AB in economics. It has often been pointed out by scholars focusing on migration and non-government organizations that although majority of Filipino overseas contract workers are university graduates, once they are employed as domestic helpers abroad, which require no specialized academic or technical training, they are effectively de-skilled and deterritorialized, experiencing contradictory class mobility. In this contradictory process, they simultaneously experience upward mobility and downward mobility because although they might earn more than they would have earned back home, they would not have had to be de-skilled, lowering their professional status if they had stayed put. In this sense, mobility is not necessarily an upward movement. It could be downward, which is to say, it is not even the same as immobility as such, but worse. In addition, some overseas contract workers do not necessarily live better lives as a result of working abroad due to complications of working arrangements, status, travel papers, and difficulties experienced by the family member has left and the ones left behind, among others. The case of Vicenta is worse than her poverty back home. Abroad, her deterritorialization came in the figure of death. One of the central images in Arrivederci is the clock, uh, as I've mentioned earlier. The clock is an image around which the story is at once textualized and thematized. So now I talk about the clock's thematization of migratory aesthetics to wrap up the discussion. Mobility is said to work with processes of continuous circulation, which in the story is inscribed in the endless and ritual repetition of everyday life as domestic workers abroad, unlike the movement of, say, a migratory quest in search of meaning or purpose or success at the end of the journey. In this repetition, the clock is the main figure, used in the story to capture the meaning or meaninglessness of their lives. To quote from the story, ang buhay nila sa Italia ay isang relo. Hindi nagbabago ng anyo ng direksyon ng mga numero. English. Their lives in Italy resemble the clock, never changing in shape, direction, or numbers. Unquote. In this story, the clock as a focal figure marks time not temporally, but spatially by its movement. One imagines the repetitive oscillation of the mundane, moving across spaces, back and forth, literally balikan. The root word is balik, same root word for balikbayan uh, and return, balik. Like a returned migrant, the balikbayan repeatedly navigating in their everyday lives the contradictions of global capitalism, holding together the tension between mobility and immobility. As Epifanio San Juan, in his article Speculations on the Filipino Diaspora, has explained about this particular short story himself, we see that the routine, I quote, we see that the routine of the Filipino community is defined by bureaucratized space that seems to replicate the schedule back home. But the chronological itinerary is deceptive because while this passage lures us into a calm compromise with what exists, the plot of attempted rape and Pica's suicide transpires behind the semblance of the normal and the ordinary. Unquote. Indeed, the truth is hidden behind the surface regularity of the clock, the mobility and immobility symbolized by the clock, concealing, as San Juan continues, quote, features and discontinuities that will only disclose themselves when the death of Vicky shatters the peace and complicated the pathos of indentured domesticity. Unquote. To wrap up, I argue that what is going on in the story is what is called diasporic claustrophobia. Arrivederci, while meaning goodbye, implies a moment of welcome. It is a going that assumes a coming. It is a fitting allusion to the movement of Vicenta's diasporic journey, the returned migrant who goes to Italy alive and comes back to the Philippines dead. Her remains sent back home inside the coffin is the embodiment of the spatial, temporal, and socio-historical reality of a Filipino domestic worker abroad. A goodbye that is not because it is premised on the return of the balikbayan in the first place, a movement in stasis, yet a mobile, yet immobile. This framing provides the expanse and depth of the figural embodiment of the dire experience of Filipino domestic workers from the beginning till the end. Such framing allows for the literal and symbolic opposition and juxtaposition between characters, setting, action tropes. Lots of tropes across geographies in their vignette-like repetition of fragmented lives across the story sections. It is experienced even by the willful Nelly, whose life is nevertheless marked by physical as well as imagined barriers from which she wants to break free. After work, she said, as the story goes, after work in the afternoon or evening, Nelly strolls along, breathes fresh air, observes her surroundings. The whole mornings and afternoons, the whole day she feels imprisoned by the walls, door, windows, floor, ceiling, roof, unquote. This sense of claustrophobia with which the story begins and ends is a function as much of plot's temporal mobility, temporal causality, as with its settings, mobile speciality. As such, mobility and immobility as semiotic oppositions abound in the mobile elements of the story in terms of the character's representation, like Nelly as active character and Vicenta as passive character. Plot's movement, linear journey, and dispersive diaspora, diasporic imaginary, as in national and global, setting as in place and space, or the bifurcation of nature and culture, as in the cave versus cathedral, and so on. Filipino diasporic mobility comes into play in the promise of diaspora, that is to say, sa labas ng bayan, or outside, beyond bayan, as in country and people. In Italy, as it were, as a dynamic, if complex and contradictory phenomenon, constituted as it is by its tense and conflicted negotiation with its underside in the immobility of home, sa loob ng bayan, in which inside and outside fold into each other as interrelated, if also conflicted connections. Between points A and B, the contradictory human connections in their reciprocal constitution are developed or stunted, caught between mobility and immobility in structures of social processes of unequal geopolitical relations. Thematically, the story's migratory aesthetic, process by which mobility is textualized in art forms, and how art forms are textualized mobility is referred to as diasporic claustrophobia. It underlines the complex lives of the Filipino domestic workers in Italy as the story begins with Vicenta's breathlessness and ends with her suicide. Indeed, as Filipino domestic workers abroad try to navigate diasporic distances, they are by turns mobilized and immobilized in the global capitalist market as objectified migratory commodities. Thank you.